Well, thank you everybody for coming back so promptly from lunch. I'm conscious that we've actually had a really good morning in terms of the quality of the speakers we've had, and we've only got 45 minutes to cover a topic that I think is going to be really interesting and fascinating. So I'll try and be punchy and crisp and not talk as much as I usually do at these kinds of things. One thing I will say, though, I'm very pleased to be invited here today by Subex, and it is because I think this topic is of great interest and should be of concern to the vast majority of you in the room. Whether you're working in this sphere now or not, I think this is something that should be on your horizon and something you should be thinking about in terms of whether it will be an area that will impact your career in future and how it might impact your career in future, how you might take on the opportunities that are presented by what I might call network assurance. For me, my frustration with this area is that it's great that we're talking about it today. It's great that we're talking about it this year, and it's got more attention this year. But why haven't we been talking about it for many years? When it comes to network capex, we know that this is an area where companies spend billions of dollars. We also know that this is an area where telcos are absolutely plagued with bad data, where companies simply don't know what their inventory is, where they're not sure of what's been installed, where they're not clear on whether they're making wise investment choices. And furthermore, when we think about the movement that we've seen in revenue assurance from reactive to proactive, and we also think a bit about Subex's history, when they coined the phrase the ROC, they were thinking about something that was a play on, obviously, the knock. The knock is this thing which we may think of as monitoring all the time, whether our network has got a problem. Quick, let's fix it. But it's not necessarily the most forward-thinking way of running a business. There's a problem, let's fix it. And revenue assurance has hopefully moved forward from the attitude of there's a problem, let's fix it, to can we get ahead of the curve? I think when we think about what's happened with the phrase ROC, I'd like to be hearing more about how we're getting ahead of the curve on network capex, and how guys like you can perhaps find that there is a whole new string to your bow in terms of adding value to your company. So I'm joined by three fabulous people. I won't talk too much more. I will hand over to them because I think they've got a lot to say. We know that you've been introduced to John already. We have James here from Telstra Global. He's going to give us some of the customer's perspective. I hope that some of you will also give us some perspective. But to begin with, Steve Cotton heads up the revenue management side of things for the TM Forum. And I wanted to ask you to begin, Steve. You've set up a new team now within the TM Forum. You're responding to customer demand out there that you're perceiving in the marketplace. Can you tell us a little bit about what demand you've seen and how the TM Forum is responding by setting up this new team to cover what you're calling asset assurance?
Sure, Eric. First, I'd like to thank Subex for inviting me to be on this panel. This is a very important subject to TM Forum and its members. I'd also like to go back a little bit. First, I'm sorry I can't be there live to raise a glass at the cocktail hour, so maybe I'll ask my colleagues on the panel to do that on my behalf. But I am joining you virtually, and in case you didn't notice, that pudgy pillow on the couch is my avatar there that Eric is sitting next to. So in any case, it's a very great pleasure to be here. And I'd like to go back a little bit. Both Eric and John have a very strong storied history in helping me in the TM Forum to move the revenue management subject forward. It was actually the day I joined the forum in 2010 that John and Eric headed up brand new interest group areas and project teams, Eric in enterprise risk management and John in fraud management at that time. And that was TM Forum's first active foray into the entire enterprise management arena in our business process model that we use to organize our work. That was enterprise risk management with revenue assurance and fraud management underneath it. But the enterprise management area also always included asset management. And as Eric said, there's been a long need for some progress in this area. And it actually, Eric, was 2 years ago that we formed the first asset management project team in TM Forum and actually produced some preliminary work in the form of an asset management guidebook. And I'm really thrilled to have Subex now taking up the mantle of that leadership to move it forward. Subex and John leading our new asset management project into the next year's frameworks releases with a lot of interesting aspects. And I'd hope James would be one of our enthusiastic sponsors for that work in the TM Forum. We always look for service providers to give us that guidance and priority and requirements leadership that the vendor community needs to tailor the work so that all of our members get the benefit. But in any case, we do have a lot of work ongoing, and the entire enterprise management area is so important. I always point out that we spend a lot of time looking at the income statement and operating expenses and efficiencies there, but there's all sorts of opportunities on the balance sheet, and I know the general management worries about the balance sheet at least as much as they do about the income statement, and there's a lot of opportunities for Subex's products to help and for the entire revenue assurance and fraud management community to weigh in on this too. So I'm sure John will have more observations on that. But once again, I'd like to thank everybody for letting me have some say in this today.
Can I ask you, Steve, which operators so far are engaged with the asset assurance program?
Well,
because I think maybe there's going to be some people in the room as well we'd like to see get on board with that.
Yeah, what we did originally is John put out a call for participation, and John can comment on who's responded to that so far. We have a formal process before we talk about somebody being committed at that level, but we have had considerable interest, among others, from the Tata Communications has long-standing interest in pursuing this subject, and they've volunteered in the past to be a sponsor, and I'm sure we'll continue to want to be on that track going forward. So there's a very prominent one that we have good relations with, and like I say, John may have some more in the hopper that are going to be rolling out soon.
Great, great. Well, James, I'll bring you in now to speak on behalf of the telecoms operator. What was it that, can you tell us a little bit about Telstra and how they've approached this topic and what's drawn them into this topic and what benefits you've seen so far by trying to deal with, I don't know whether you call it network assurance or asset assurance?
I was going to say, I think the topic itself is a very difficult one to actually define, and I'm glad that we've really tried to narrow it down because, if you look at it in isolation and what are the networks that you have in terms of internal, external, data, voice, etc., then we could have spent the rest of the day just talking about this. But if we try and look at it from the sort of core asset perspective, then what really drives the analytics for Telstra is the customer journey. And what I mean by that, so it's a very easy thing to throw out, but it's really about trying to understand the quality of call data or transactional data that goes over the network, how we can improve that, when we can improve it from a time of day perspective, and also very much from a seasonality perspective. There was an interesting occurrence very recently where we had some spikes which needed investigation on the network, and it turned out that we'd had a significant increase because of Hajj, and it was actually just because we'd actually had some specifically attractive rates out in the market which had caused that spike. Without all of this data, we would not be able to really plan both from an expansion perspective from a geographic and a capacity, but also we wouldn't be able to monitor the actual quality of the information that goes across it. It's interesting to think about, so for us, some of the quality and some of the analytics that we get out are around the duration of calls and the dropouts, and it's interesting that you then have to try and look into the actual demographics, because a traditional voice-based call for Europe is a very different duration to a typical voice-based call in Asia. So it is a learning tool for us, and for us it's really about improving both the future planning, and that's probably its biggest driver, as well as looking back to make sure that we optimize both the assets that are on it and particularly the customer experience through the quality of the actual network itself.
Can I ask specifically how long Telstra has been looking or working on this area? And also a little bit maybe to flesh out, because I appreciate that different telecoms companies have different organisations, where it's sitting within your organisation, this responsibility.
Well, and that's why sort of that initial question is very difficult for us to answer. So Telstra's main voice, so it has a wholesale voice engine that comes out of Australia, and although there are people in Europe that deal with that, but essentially for us, that's been going on for the last, I think it's 10 years since we got involved in far more of the actual routing and optimization. So yeah, 10 years is probably about it for Telstra. And they're really looking now at how they can actually really improve that, because it's very historic information based, and we're really looking at how we can use this sort of horrible word, big data, to try and actually produce better predictive analytics to actually understand future trends.
Fantastic.
And a lot of the information that you were talking about earlier. So.
Well, John, we've had you up on stage already again, but I think we could point out again, remind people that you're actually wearing two hats in this conversation, because you're running the asset assurance team in the TM Forum now. Can we just elaborate a little bit on what kinds of things people are looking for when telcos approach you and discuss the subject? What do they mean specifically as what they're trying to do when we say they're doing asset assurance?
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to tell you, we should have had this couch up here when I was doing my first presentation. This is kind of cool. And you guys should all come try this.
It's just because I'm lazy, you see. They know that I'm not going to walk up and down like you guys.
I think if the others had this, half of them would be asleep. In fact.
I tell you what, everybody just form a line, one at a time. So what we're trying to do with the overall, what TM Forum refers to as asset management, is what Subex is referring to as asset assurance. Synonymous terms, basically. But the overall progression of operators looking at network assets has really evolved to where you see some of the forward-thinking operators like Telstra, for instance, today, that are going out and actually sniffing and understanding what's exactly on the network. They understand where it's at, what it's doing. There's additional links in the chain. In the past, the asset management group at TM Forum had produced document deliverables that were very much focused on here's the methodology for tracking an asset through life cycle. It was very it was basically darn close to an ERP guidebook of some sort of form or fashion. But really what we're looking at now is how has asset management or asset assurance overall changed as a program or as a philosophy inside of operators, and why is it important? And so we took a look at that and said, okay, there's three legs of the stool that we really need to take into consideration here. Number one is exactly what Telstra's doing, first of all. Let's go out and understand exactly what we've got on the network and how much we're utilizing that. That second piece really blends into that utilization conversation from a capacity perspective and says, how much are we actually consuming this set of resources or assets out there? And then the third leg of that stool is looking at what's all your non-deployed pieces out there on the network. When you take all of that information together, it's not just about tracking where it is. Now it's around understanding what you should be buying, when you should be buying it, where you should be placing it, and why. And those are the kind of questions that the asset management team within TM Forum is going to be answering now. We're going to be putting that information together, and that's the charter that we currently have out. When Steve was mentioning earlier about the process in TM Forum, what we do is we create a charter that says, here's what we're going to do as a project team. And in this current project that we have out there, this current charter that we have out there right now, we're going to be doing two different things. We're going to be producing a survey in the industry to go through and really quantify and understand the depth of the problem around the operators. We believe it's pretty substantial. TM Forum believes it's pretty substantial. Every operator that we've been talking to thus far has believed it's pretty substantial. And when we have anecdotes from operators that are pulling in tens and hundreds of millions of dollars in this space alone in recovered asset value that they can re-employ into generating revenue on the network, that's big money. That's very big money. It's bigger money than we've seen in revenue assurance for the most part. Yeah, when we're talking about one operator being able to return $50 million after 1 week's worth of work, that's impressive. That's big money. And that gets people's attention. And that's exactly the kind of money we're talking about here. You know, when you talk about the returns in revenue assurance of getting, you know, a 3% return or something like that on revenues, and maybe you're pulling back in $10 or $15 million a year. Think about an operator that's spending $14 billion US a year on network build. If you can get back 0.5% of that, that's huge.
How do you see companies, processizing that? Because I mean, that to me is a very one-off exercise. You're doing an analysis of everything that's out there and going, do you know, you say you've got this, only this amount is working, you could really optimize that. How do you see companies actually turning that into a process that they can actually use on an ongoing basis?
Right. So a few answers to that question. Because when you look at the asset management spectrum or the realm of different areas across there, you're looking at, number one, optimizing what you already have. And I say optimizing, I started looking for Peter in the room to make sure I'm not, you know, crossing a boundary here. But when we start talking about that, we, number one, want to optimize the assets, which is a utilization conversation for the most part. So recovering what's stranded and utilizing that capacity that's available out there. The next piece of that is what we refer to as procurement gating, to where we're going through and understanding with what we have available in the network, what do we actually need to go out and buy. So you put together a project in somewhere in New South Wales that says, I'm going to go expand this part of the network and I've budgeted 50 million Australian dollars to go do this with. And they go through and deploy that. So, you know, it comes a long time to do that. You go to procurement, they buy all the parts that you need, and you go out and deploy that as it would normally be deployed. And then you go through and you start setting up services as they would normally be established. And then you start provisioning across all of those services. And when the field techs are usually done with that provisioning, there's a very strong probability that they did not provision everything that was available out there to provision. As a result, those assets now either become inventoried and unutilized, they become non-inventoried and lost, and one way or the other, they're lit up and they're burning power. We'll find that. With what you currently have today, you'll be able to find that. So there's those aspects as well, but the important secret sauce in a lot of asset management is that ability to talk to and understand the network on two levels. Number one is, what have I got? And number two is, what am I consuming on it? So discovery on those two levels is very key. So now put that into context of, and I'm just kind of going off here. You give me the microphone and off I go, and now I'm wearing one. So
there's a lot to say on this topic. There's a lot to say on this topic.
But what you get with that secret sauce is the understanding of rate of change. When you've got a card that's failing, when you've got equipment that's being swapped around, ERP has no idea. Once that equipment gets deployed on the network and it gets turned over to inventory, ERP has no idea except it got sent to inventory. And by the way, we've got customers out there that literally had, you know, ERP reporting, you know, millions of dollars worth of assets deployed, and the network couldn't find it. We lit up and went across the entire network, and they're lost. To this day, those assets are gone. ERP thought they went to the network, inventory never got the message, and now they're not lit up anywhere. Where'd they go? So there's a lot of conversations around that, and then the last part of that. Because understanding that rate of change on the network for all those different facets allows us to apply analytics to start predicting where we're going to have problems and where we need to have inventory at certain levels in certain warehouses at certain times. That all factors into a pretty significant savings. So there's a big hit in the beginning. Absolutely, there's a big hit in the beginning. But ongoing, understanding how all those, you know, tens of thousands of pieces of equipment on the network are continually moving and transposing where they're located and so on, makes a huge impact, and we track that on a daily basis. So, and the last piece of that then comes into decommission management. There's a whole arena around decommission management and choreography that takes place that, when done appropriately, allows the business to recover as much free cash back into the business as possible, while at the same time, while that decommission choreography is taking place around the network, it may take a year to completely decommission one particular make and model of equipment, for instance. It may take longer, may take less. But in the meantime, you've got other points of presence around the network that are replenishing that equipment on the shelves. Analytics can tell you, of the ones that you're harvesting and decommissioning over here, how much of that can I reposition because I know I'm going to have failures and replacement needs, versus how many can I get immediately onto resale market and then track it to make sure it gets there. So there's a lot of facets of that. Very long answer to your question, so I apologize. Sorry. But that, you know, gives you a little bit of an idea.
I think it's such a big topic. I mean, just as I was listening to you there, I was thinking how you could have a 2-day conference on this topic. And in a parallel universe, because the amounts involved, the very large amounts involved in network capex, you could imagine a 2-day conference where we were all doing that for a living, and then maybe eventually we'll get around to talking for 45 minutes on revenue assurance or fraud management. Because there's so much actually in what you've said there, and I would encourage you to just unpack it a little bit. It sounds to me like you're talking about, if we remember how revenue assurance has matured in the past, the low-hanging fruit in this area, what you recover, and Alex mentioned this as well in his presentation in terms of stranded assets, the amounts that can be recovered, the amounts that improve your business very quickly as a result of data cleanse, as a result of network discovery, is huge. Bigger than the low-hanging fruit used to be when we first did revenue assurance. But also, what you're doing is slightly different to what happened in those days with revenue assurance, because you're not just talking about the low-hanging fruit, you're already talking about what sounds to me like a clear maturity path here, where first you cleanse the data, first you understand what network assets you have, and then you build upon that superior data, superior predictive analysis, superior forecasting, superior understanding of profitability of your own network. I mean, you talked earlier on about customers, and wouldn't it be good if we know how profitable, which customers are profitable, which ones aren't? Well, why don't we think the same way about our network assets? Do we really understand which bits of our network are making us money and which are not making us money? So I think really you're kind of giving me a maturity path here, and the only thing I worry about here is that you need to put this down on paper, because actually this is so dense. Yeah. It's a lot of information to take in. So you're currently doing some work in terms of
on the TM forum.
Yeah, in terms of what's the current lineup in terms of output.
Well, so the first thing we talked about was producing that industry survey, but right on the heels of that is the catalyst, where we're actually going we're going to build a prototype of this. Subex has already got the prototype built for our purposes, but the purpose of a catalyst is to bring in other industry players to form a critical mass, if you will, of movement in that direction as an industry. And that's where Steve and I are going to be working on the TM Forum side to really drive that program home as an industry standard, as the next big thing that, quite frankly, anybody in a revenue management capacity should really be taking a pretty serious look at. So one of the things that we have open right now is with this current charter, we're looking for additional operators to actually come on board as a sponsor. There's no cost or anything associated with it, but and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong here. I think it's the vendors that have to pay. But that's the way that these work, though, is that to build up the momentum within building prototypes that we show as a catalyst, and we'll show this in Nice, and we'll show it to wherever we can get somebody to look, basically. But yeah, we'll show these at the TM Forum, at the Management World, or the the digital disruption conferences that are coming up in the future. We'll start building that prototype in the next 2 to 3 months. But there's an invitation for operators here. If you guys would like to get involved, what we do is we use you as sounding boards, as looking at what we're building as a group of vendors in the industry. And you guys become the counselors to basically come back and say, you're in the right direction, this is pertinent. Or you're doing something that, no, that's not the way we do it in real life. This is the way we would want to look at something like that.
Can I just
Eric, let me add to that pick up on something James said. The business assurance programs that I oversee are in multiple dimensions. Revenue management, obviously, at central core, but the other two that I oversee are customer management and data analytics, right down the central pathway that James brought up. And what we try to do, especially in the digital services era, where there's all of these engaged parties from many sides of the equation, is balance the customer value delivered and the shareholder value delivered. And it gets right back into the center of deploying and employing those assets that we're talking about, because they can either dissatisfy a customer the way they're delivered, or suppress demand if there's not sufficient capacity in the proper geography. And so the customer side comes in from the top line with revenues and lower churn if you satisfy, and then the shareholder value side comes in on the bottom line, even beneath the EBITDA line, because you've got to get beyond the depreciation and amortization of the assets to have any returns for the shareholders. And so you're hitting it from both ends with the balance sheet and the income statement, but it's meant to be addressed as a holistic approach in the business assurance so that you balance customer and shareholder with the enterprise management of the enterprise itself, but looking from the customer's perspective. And I think James has said it just as well as I could have, and that's why we're treating it as a holistic approach in enterprise management rather than siloed.
Let me quickly just do you a favor by asking a straw poll of people in the room. Who currently works for a telco where there is work taking place to improve the network capex spend, to make better use of the assets out there? Hands up. Okay. Who is working for a telco where there is a plan or intention to do something like this in future? No hands. Who thinks that they should be doing something like this in future and sees this as an opportunity for their department? I'm sticking up high so I can see. Don't be shy. That's great. So that's a good sign there that people, although perhaps sometimes senior management may not be aware of this, I think certainly people in the room are conscious about the potential here. Coming back to you, James, always the problem with telecoms is that wonderful people like you and other people in the room can have the right idea, the heart in the right place, can see what is going wrong in the business, but sometimes persuading other people in the company to make this a priority area can be a hard thing to do. Can you comment at all a bit about how to win people's hearts and minds over to the importance of this?
Well, I think it's probably become an easier sell in the last couple of years, I mean, because of the market dynamics outside of telecoms particularly. But traditionally it is always a difficult sell because by implication you're suggesting that people haven't necessarily been managing this as well as they could. But when you can articulate some of the numbers that we're talking about here, then it's relatively simple to process that at a senior level and at least get some buy-in that actually this is worth a look. And actually you can then talk about some of the way that actually this improves capacity planning and asset distribution. Because if you don't use this information, then really your network by definition must be suboptimal because you don't actually understand when you need to bring on capacity, where you should actually be delivering new nodes or any of the equipment. So yeah, I think from a business perspective, it is now a very easy sell. I mean, the moment you mention any sort of saving numbers, people latch onto those. It was a harder sell in previous years.
Okay. So you really think that now we're in a situation where the sheer numbers makes the argument for you. You present the data, this is the value that can be added to the business, boom.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very difficult to argue against at least performing a short-term review. So even if all you say is, we're going to do phase one of what we're talking about here, because if it demonstrates actually that you are using all of your assets fantastically and your capacity planning is fantastic, then it's purely an endorsement of everything that you're doing, and that money is not wasted. It demonstrates that actually you're doing it all right. If it doesn't, then the savings are going to be self-evident. Okay.
So for people in the room, again, maybe thinking about this area but haven't started any work in it, what does that initial review look like? Is it a very quick, dirty exercise? Give me a feel for what you'd recommend as the amount of effort to put in to get the business case up and running.
I mean, honestly, you're going to get the returns out that you put in. So if you go for quick and dirty, then all you're going to get is an indication that you should be doing a review. Okay. But you probably knew that if you were going to at least go down the quick and dirty review anyway. I mean, the question comes back to how easy is it for actually departments and resource to interpret and get hold of the analytics in the first place. That is the business challenge, actually getting the data out and having a look at it to then decide how are you actually monitoring your quality? Are you monitoring your quality? Are you actually aware of all of the capacity issues? Do you track when you've got spikes? Do you know when you've got downtime, why it was caused? I mean, is it fraud, which is obviously a very hot topic here, or is it actually that there were just a lot of valid users trying to use your service at any one point in time? So it's really about how you can get the data out and whether you actually have people who are either experienced enough or engaged enough to interpret that data. Okay.
I mean, John, perhaps you can pick up on this one as well. When you first form a relationship where you're looking to engage in a project of this type with a customer, what typically are the the first one or two things that you would do in a telecoms company, or you would seek to help a telecoms company in order to build that business case?
And certainly we want to understand what they have pre-existing in place. It is very common to find an operator today, for instance, that has some form of capacity analytics or capacity planning that feeds directly up into overall network planning operations. That's a common find. Operators having potential for some form of discovery on the network, the robustness of it is something we need to evaluate. But overall, this is a program. This is a departure from what Subex had historically done as far as deploying the software. This is a program implementation into an operator to make this as a practice within the business. So understanding how the business actually is currently operating and identifying within that assessment of where those gaps are and those opportunities are is where those reusable components are. Those are all things that we bring together in that overall methodology to engage with the customer on something like this. But some of the important things that we run into on these types of exercises are very analytically based, but they're also very surprising to the operators. When they were surprising to us the first couple times out of the chute, because we didn't realize how much money was really involved here. And then we started seeing this and we thought, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. And it became very surprising to the operators to realize that much activity was going on and they weren't able to monetize it. That much loss was taking place and they weren't able to do anything with it. Give you an example, especially in the mobile environments. 3G to 4G services, there's a bunch of varying reports on the types of bandwidth created. Net is you're consuming in some cases an average number of 10 times more data than you were previously. Now, who is able to actually go out and charge their customers 10 times more money for going to 4G? And the answer is pretty much nobody. When I upgraded to 4G services for myself and my kids and my wife, everybody's got 4G, we're all happy. That's great. I paid less money to do it than I was paying for my 3G services. So how do you justify these days increasing your network to handle that much additional bandwidth and you can't monetize it? And the answer is something like an asset management program, an asset assurance program that allows you to go through and quickly reclaim tens and even hundreds of millions of dollars worth of assets out there and then put you on a path to very structured, very scientifically and analytically driven and predictive environments of buying exactly what you need, when you need it, and having a justification as why. One of the big selling points for this type of a program from both our perspective but also from TM Forum's perspective is that this allows us to now connect, because you look at network planning and finance, and they've always worked in opposing camps. They're not each other's buddy. They don't play golf together. They're not coming to everybody's house for dinner. They don't. This program brings them together. This allows the network planning people to be able to show immediately why they need something on the network. They don't have to go justify it. The numbers are there. Finance sees the exact same information on where hotspots are, when those hotspots are going to go critical, and how they need to resolve it, and what they have available to resolve it with, and what actually needs to be physically purchased. This is the only program that really has ever come into light that between TM Forum and the work that we're doing, we're going to be able to align those programs together and give them all the information they need to where that adversarial relationship doesn't exist anymore.
From a finance perspective, I mean, it demonstrates a utilization and a visible return on capital. So
exactly.
It's a much easier sell.
Yeah,
and one thing I would add on that is that there's an entire set of interfaces that have been standardized in TM Forum for integrating systems, whether they be frameworks compliant 100% or 50% or not. And it seems to me an obvious opportunity to identify the interfaces that would be between the inventory and catalog systems of the network management world and the ERP financial asset management of the financial world, and to have a continuous flow of communications between the two domains of views, so that you had that linkage automated to the degree it's possible and give that much more visibility right from the procurement moment until the retirement moment.
I agree. I mean, but I think also one thing I'd want to say here in terms of the word optimization, or what was said earlier on, I don't think we're talking about an area, forgive me, don't mean to be rude to anybody in the room, but I don't think we're talking about comparing a Mercedes saloon to an F1 car here. I think we're talking about people riding bicycles needing to get onto a moped at this rate, because there is a lot of value here that is just simply being wasted. I mean, in terms of lost assets, stranded assets, but also great underuse of assets as well, great failure to exploit the assets that are already in the company and to understand where investment will drive future returns. Coming back to you, Steve, just another question for you. You see the whole piece in terms of revenue management within the TM Forum, including areas like fraud management and revenue assurance. Do you want to elaborate a bit about the way that you see people maybe who work in the fraud area can also approach this topic of asset assurance with their fraud hat on?
Sure, it's very clear to me. Certainly a lot of the work in fraud management focuses on telecommunications use fraud, theft of services, but there's an entire realm of procurement fraud that occurs to me, that there could be either fraudulent deliveries by suppliers, or, God forbid, but it happens all the time, fraudulent collusion between the procurement arm inside the company and a given vendor that is certainly in the realm of what law enforcement and fraud management techniques are used for anyway, besides theft of service. And the same thing on the revenue assurance side. If you looked at margin assurance, where you're trying to yield the most net, at least operating income to the operating income line, that provides a new source of revenue that was uncaptured before to yield to the shareholders' returns after you minimize the impact of asset depreciation and amortization on the operating income side.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, I appreciate that we're probably running near to the end of this session. As I say, I could actually go all day about this. Are there any questions from the floor before I completely hog the conversation and don't let anyone else speak? Come on, there must be some questions from the floor. I know that you've all got terrible data in your companies and you have no idea where your network assets are. Is it just you're too shy? You don't want to admit? And they're going to catch you later, I think, John, and ask you.
Well, let me give you the quick, here's the pitch. With TM Forum right now, we have that charter out there. We're looking for operators to jump on board and sponsor with us to help be our guide, our counselors in this area. We've got one prototype out here that's the Subex Asset Assurance platform that we can show you right now. But we're going to collaborate and bring in a bigger, broader footprint of that for the catalyst creation at TM Forum. And if you guys would like to be involved with that, it's no obligation. There's nothing to do except be our counselor for that and our advisor on that and sponsor on the charter.
Does it differentiate between voice and data, or is it just traffic as far as it's concerned?
It's network.
Right.
And so we don't differentiate whether we're talking edge or core, whether we're talking mobile, whether we're talking data backhaul, whether we're talking, it's an encompassing stance right now. And we haven't set down, I can tell you that we've got, one customer right now that's very fixed and backhaul oriented. We've got another one that's totally backhaul oriented. We've got another one that's 3 and 4G oriented.
Right.
So we're covering the spectrum. So we don't have any boundaries as far as that goes. The goal here is to get on board with a methodology that's going to be generally applicable, and then drill into what are the nuances that we need to make sure we cover off on a fixed traditional legacy basis, or even a fixed broadband or data basis, or a mobile basis.
And can it reach outside of essentially the core network? I mean, can it reach the customer CPE?
As long as they're discoverable components, or they don't even have to be discoverable. They need to be able to be, discoverable is optimal, but not necessary. But knowing that those pieces of CPE are out there and trackable within inventory and ERP environments makes them a candidate. Absolutely.
One thing I'd add on that from TM Forum, and this is from the customer management side, and once again, James mentioned this, we actually model the customer journey through a series of touch points and link those into frameworks, both the application information and business process frameworks, so that the value stream deliveries of customer value can be correlated to the entire life cycle in the business process framework. So there's, and I enforce that synergy among the different dimensions of business assurance, of revenue management, customer management, and data analytics. And so that's something that can be relied upon, that this is a holistic attack on the entire subject.
Yeah, and I like the way that you keep using the word holistic there, Steve, because I think that this is a potential game-changing area for how people view the role of assurance within the telecoms firm and how they view their own, how they add value to their own business. Because with this improved understanding of what's happening at network level, you're really opening a huge new view on things that previously people tended to shy away from. I mean, I remember myself being in telcos where the number one problem was you just didn't know. It's just this black box. The data was wrong. You couldn't put together the numbers to even start going, what's the value here? You just knew it was rotten data, and people get frustrated and they start shrugging their shoulders and you get tired and you go do something else instead, because you actually could get results more quickly. But if we can get to a point where we're starting to deliver value, results in a manageable time frame that management can understand. And I think also this is an area where CFOs, to come back to the relationship between finance and the network people, this is an area where CFOs are really understanding and looking at how their company is financed. They've raised a lot of money from shareholders. They're always going to the bank and borrowing a lot of money. They're very, very keen to have a much better understanding of how that money is in the end invested in huge investments for their company, and they just want to understand what's happening. It may not necessarily always be a bad thing, but I think it does necessarily, for anybody who's reporting to a CFO, that begs the question of who in his team, or her team, apologies, don't mean to be sexist, but who in his or her team is going to pick up the baton here and run with it and say, we understand on behalf of you. Well, it's been quite a technical area. It's been an area that's been quite hard to understand because of the data. People in the room are actually the most natural choice. I can't think of anyone better. Can you, John?
Sounded pretty good to me. So.
Great. Well, I think we're on time. I think we haven't overrun. Maybe one question, if anybody wants a question. I'll give you one more chance. If no one's got. Oh, do we have a question? No. Here we go.
Thanks. I think that everybody probably agrees, although I was quite surprised at how few hands went up when you asked the question, that asset assurance is, to borrow one of Alex's acronyms, one of the NBTs, the next big things. But my concern is how really practical is it? We can have all the data we want, we can do the analytics, we can know that we've got underutilized assets. But certainly in the context of where we come from, which is the sort of African context, getting sites is a nightmare. Redeploying assets, even if they're underutilized, the assets are obviously, there are other reasons for them to be there. There may be political considerations in our case. So knowing what you need to do and being able to do it are two very different things. And I think that's where you're going to find maybe a bit of a mismatch between what you should be doing and what you can do.
Okay. I think that's a very valid point. I'll come straight back to you though. Forgive me, I'll hog this one. My feeling in response to that is, even if there's not much you can do about certain decisions because, say, they're political, it's really useful to have the information as to how the company's money is being spent / misspent as a result of having to please government authorities and the rest. And presenting that kind of information is a very powerful bargaining tool which can change the nature and frame the debates differently. As a result, you may actually find that your political pressures change somewhat. So I think you're actually, that's a very valid point, that maybe we can't always change things, but still I would say, though it's harder to put a number on, there is some value in having the information even if you know you can't do very much about it. But very good point. Great. Well, I think that was, as I say, I think we could do 2 days. And maybe next year Subex will do 2 days on this topic and we'll have a half-hour on revenue assurance and fraud management. But I don't know, would anyone like that? Well, we'll see. We'll ask them over the coffee break. But in the meantime, can I thank you all for taking part, my panellists, Steve, dialing in, James, and for John. A good round of applause for all of them. I think it was a good panel.